Hello, everyone. This is Philosophy for the People. After slight technical difficulties, we're here and we're live. And it's been a long time, but we're back. Exciting things have happened in my life since we last spoke, Ben.
Oh,
I know after long searching, I have an epic skeleton T-shirt.
nice.
I wanted an epic skeleton T-shirt which had a skeleton with a gun on it. But the only ones with skeletons with guns on them also had women with guns on them, and they also had boobs. I didn't want that on my T-shirt, so I had to settle for a skeleton with a sword. But I'm pretty happy with that.
Who among us can't relate to that story?
All bought from the places which in America now just actually sell weed, but in the UK just sell weed paraphernalia and epic T-shirts and dream catchers.
Fair enough.
We're going to talk about Marxism then.
Yeah. No, Karl Marx lived and died many decades before the first epic skeleton T-shirt was printed.
We should dig him up and then base an epic skeleton T-shirt off his skeleton.
Fair enough.
I love to close be like, oh, I'm done with these essays, and then close them all as I'm finished reading them, and then instantly have to reopen them so I can post a link in chat.
Right.
But what are we talking about this week, Ben?
Yeah, so this week we're talking about a book from 1992 called Reconstructing Marxism by Andrew Levine and Erik Olin Wright and Elliott Sober, which was interesting to me when I heard that this book existed. Right, so I've been, a while ago, I think I was teaching a class on G.A. Cohen's book, Karl Marx's Theory of History, and Fred Kale used to do all the YouTube stuff for Jacobin. Recommended this book to me, or asked if I'd ever heard of it, maybe, and I had not, right? And then I think I actually picked up a copy then, but I didn't start reading it until Tibor mentioned it in one of my discussions with him last year. And it's a really interesting book. And one of the things that, like, this is not the main point of interest, but one thing that's interesting about it to me is that Elliott Sober is one of the names on the cover. Since Erik Olin Wright is somebody who, I'm sure I first heard his name in like a Jacobin article or something talking about him. And Andrew Levine, I actually was not familiar with until I read this book. Although I did, I've done a little bit of poking into his other stuff since then. And apparently, in addition to the academic work, he actually had like a whole, like if you go over to Counterpunch, like it looks like he wrote like dozens of articles for them too. So, he was also doing that kind of thing, yes, something like that. Yeah. He was past, I don't know if, essentially. Right. So, he's passed away since, but he was seems to have been pretty prolific in the kind of day-to-day political writing as well as the academic stuff. But Elliott Sober is somebody I definitely had heard of, and I had no idea that this man had ever even been interested in Marxism.
Right. If you go to his Wikipedia and you type in Marx, the only result is in the bibliography.
Yeah, for this book, right? So
everything else is about philosophy of biology.
Yeah, exactly. So mostly, the reason that I'd certainly heard lots about Elliott Sober, during the late Jurassic when I was in graduate school was that, he was a very big deal as a philosophy of science guy, as you say, philosophy of biology. He was somebody who sort of, this is the time when in the, ridiculous country where I live, we were kind of having the last of the school board wars against, about like teaching intelligent design and all of that stuff. And he was he was like a fairly prominent good guy in that conflict, and as an advocate of Darwinian evolution and the separation of church and state and all that good stuff. And
Your sound has just gone bad. I don't know if you've unplugged your mic.
ooh, I did not. Let
And
me.
now you're normal again. Exciting. I just had to
Okay.
scare it.
Okay. All right. Fair enough. Yeah, it's the device whose name I'm not remembering right now that you plug the mic into.
The thingy
That,
Bob.
yeah, the thingamabob, it's blinking as I talk and the way it's supposed to. But in any case, that so it, he, I don't know, I think he also wrote like a textbook, that I remember for that period. So he was a big deal, but not for this, right? Like, and it's just interesting that even if watered down in certain respects, we'll get into, right, that like there is like a lot of core Marxist and socialist stuff that's advocated in this book. It's like, wow, it's not a side of Elliott Sober I knew existed. But in any case, if you're sort of familiar in a general way with like Karl Marx's Theory of History, that book that I mentioned earlier, which is originally from the late 1970s. There was another edition that was like 2001, 2000, and that kind of style of analytical Marxism, by which I mean, analytical Marxism in the most general sense, I mean, the sort of closest to a canonical definition I think exists is the one in the introduction to the 2000 edition of Marx's Theory of History, where, Cohen says that, essentially it's about, doing Marxism in a way that uses the methodological tools from mainstream philosophy and social sciences, of sort of ways of trying to think more rigorously that you get from these fields, that some Marxists would say are bad and undialectical, or something like that. And in particular, the reason I mentioned Karl Marx's Theory of History a couple times is that quite a bit of the work in, like, certainly that Cohen was doing in the last decade, really decade or two of his life, especially, was normative philosophy. He was like arguing with libertarians and Rawlsians about property and distributive justice and all that stuff, which is good stuff. Uh, and I actually like the vast majority of I've got criticisms, but I like the vast majority of what he says about this. But there's a sense in which that's not even really Marxism at all, properly speaking. It's not like un-Marxist. It's just a different thing, right? That if that like when you're making a normative case for socialism, then you're doing a different activity than you are when you're on the fact side of the fact value distinction and you're thinking about historical materialism or class analysis. And I mean, like, that's the stuff that I really think of more as like Marxism, properly
Right.
speaking.
Because, I mean, there's different ideas of what we might mean by Marxism, but there are some people who will insist that kind of Marxism has no normative dimension. But in that case, unless you think there shouldn't be any normative dimension in our society
Yeah,
generally or whatever, that there shouldn't really be normative politics, which seems impossible.
yeah,
And then you have to accept that there is some like good normative, non-Marxist in some sense, pro-socialist
yeah,
argument.
yeah, exactly. Right. Like, you could either say, like, I mean, ultimately, it's probably just a semantic disagreement. You could either say that Marxism does have a normative dimension, which comes apart from its other dimensions, or you can say, well, that's not Marxism, but it's like also good, right? And either way, I'm perfectly happy to talk either way. But the focus of reconstructing Marxism is overwhelmingly on non-normative Marxism, on historical materialism and class analysis. And there's like, I mean, like, I think you add it all up, and there's probably like a page, 2 pages that of that book that deal sort of directly with with normative subjects, which I like, just because not because I think that normative pro-socialist argumentation is a bad thing. In fact, I clearly think it's a good thing. I do it all the time. Um, but just because I'm a fan of analytical Marxism as a research program in general, and I would like more attention to be paid to those other, if you want to talk this way, those other dimensions of Marxism. And I think that this book is really worth reading, even though in the essay that we're kind of talking about a couple of essays today, because they're all connected in the subject matter. But the main essay that we're talking about today, I'm criticizing the stuff in the book that I disagree with. But before getting to the criticisms, I really would say, look, if you're at all interested in this stuff, read the book. It's a very, very carefully, it's very clearly written. It's like very, it's very careful and rigorous, and it's, in making distinctions and sort of spelling out possible alternate views and all of that stuff. And I think
it was unfortunately written in the 90s.
Yes, that is kind of ultimately my conclusion, that it was unfortunately written in the 90s. Hence the stuff that I disagree with, I think, is just kind of ambient 90s-ness in the drinking water. But yeah, like, I think this is in some ways, right? Like, this is still kind of the cutting edge of in a certain sense, right, of this kind of research program, because by and large it kind of fizzled out after this, not really because of sort of internal intellectual problems, but just kind of because the ambient 90s-ness in the drinking water, sort of led to there being less interest in it. I think ultimately would be, is what I tend to think. I mean, I think you can find stuff in the 2020s that harkens back to that sort of research program in certain ways. I think the obvious case would be Vivek Chibber's book, The Class Matrix, is sort of doing a kind of Marxist sociology in a very analytical Marxist kind of vein. But in terms of this sort of big questions about, like, capital M Marxism, what's about Marxist theory of history, about like what exactly we're talking about when we talk about class analysis, how is there some sense in which in which class is more fundamental than other forms of oppression, etc., like that, those kinds of issues. I think in some ways, yeah, in some ways we are still kind of in 1992, just in the sense that there hasn't really been an updated version of this book to sort of like revisit this stuff, and now, which there definitely should be. But
well, if there's young scholars listening, that's a research project for you.
Yes, please, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, the first part of the book, is devoted to historical materialism, and roughly the second part is class analysis. And I think they have interesting and plausible things to say about historical materialism. I'm maybe a little bit more optimistic than they are about certain aspects of like orthodox historical materialism, although I also realize that that's like me kind of gesturing at like, oh, I think we could like, I think there's like a decent argument to be made here that I haven't actually made anywhere, right? Like I just I think that you could probably fill in some of those blanks in plausible ways, but basically, where they come down on historical materialism is actually still like honestly, it makes it a little bit confusing to me that Tibor was as enthusiastic about the book as he is, because like I
Right.
think that I think that I think that it still lands in a much more Marxist place.
Right. I mean,
On
from the two essays of yours that I've read about this book, to the even, I mean, apart from maybe this one line
yeah,
towards the end, you're like, who knows anyway.
yeah.
It does seem very, very Marxist, just with an infection of 90s-ness to it, with that, but doesn't really, like, there's so much less Marxist stuff coming out at the same time as this book. This
Oh my
book seems
God, yeah,
insanely orthodox in comparison.
totally, yeah. I mean, you think about like hegemony and social strategy and all that kind of
Yeah,
stuff, and
exactly. Yeah, I was exactly just thinking of that.
yeah, no, definitely. Yeah. So I mean, do you want to do like a few minutes on the historical materialism part, or skip straight to the class analysis?
I was going to ask if you wanted to talk about the triangle first, because the
Sure. Yeah.
triangle's about them all, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, that is definitely a good way to bring it all together.
In the
Uh,
Illuminati.
yeah. So so yeah, there is this neat illustration. If you go look at the class analysis essay, that so that's Analytical Marxism in the 1990s, the one that the link is in the description below.
And
You'll
in the chat, if you are listening on This Is Revolution.
Yes, I could stick it in the other chat as well, I guess, while we're thinking about this. So um, so so if there we go, I just put it in the GTA chat. So yeah, the first illustration after Andy's beautiful thumbnail that you'll see in there is this triangle, this like triad of classical Marxism, which is uh, basically, so the idea is there are 3 points and then there are kind of lines connecting each one to the other two. So there's Marxism as class analysis, Marxism as scientific socialism, and Marxism as class emancipation. So, and part of their point in introducing this is that part of the appeal of classical Marxism is that it's all of these at the same time, and they're sort of mutually reinforcing. That this that the combination of these three, they say, makes for this sort of very powerful and attractive, um, you know, intellectual program. So at the top of the triangle is Marxism as class emancipation, which is the thing they spend by far the least time on, which is that normative dimension that the that they say at one point sort of ideal of classlessness, right? You think about, okay, what sort of it's makes you want to be a Marxist in the first place. And I kind of say in the essay, you could in principle imagine somebody who in a certain sense was a Marxist but not committed to this. Like, I think it's sort of psychologically unlikely, but you could imagine somebody who thought that who was a dyed-in-the-wool Marxist in the other two senses. They thought that historical materialism was totally right. They thought like Marxist class analysis of contemporary society was totally right. They, maybe even they were so orthodox about both of those that they thought that socialism was inevitable, but they saw it as like an inevitable tragedy, right? That they wanted to prolong, like postpone for as long as possible. So I don't know of anybody with that combination of views. And as I say, I think it's probably psychologically unlikely, but you could in principle have that.
I wonder if Peter Hitchens ever passed through it at some point in his life, because he was both a Marxist and now he's like an enormously pessimistic conservative. But due
Yeah.
to the fact that kind of like Marxism as a theory kind of died out for a while, I'm not sure if there was a good crossover point for him there.
Yeah. He does seem like somebody who could pull it off psychologically. If anybody could. So yeah, that is a very interesting question. Like when Hitchens, if you read his book, Rage Against God, which I enjoyed. It's like There are zero thoughts that I agree with anywhere in that book.
Batting zero.
But I enjoyed the book. Actually, no, he does have one, well, he has a lot of good lines, but there's like I mean, he's a good writer, but he has, but there is a good line I think is in that book that I guess does express a thought that seems reasonable to me, which is where he says that he basically says, I don't know what Christopher's talking about. We weren't raised in Christianity. The religion we were raised in was, and every word starts with a capital letter, we won the war. But in any case, it's but it's a very strange book, but it's like kind of fascinating because it's really well written and it's a window into this very alien worldview. And because he's somebody who like, he thinks he's like vociferously opposed to legalized marijuana because he thinks it's so dangerous. He sort of as far as I can follow the train of thought and his like the stuff that he says about religion a lot of the times, it almost seems like the idea is that the reason you should take a leap of faith and believe in God is because like we need it for social stability. He says a lot of things along those lines. But yeah, there might have been a point, I think in the 1970s when he had his sort of borderline religious experience. He said he and his girlfriend were like, I don't know, backpacking or motorcycling or something through, continental Europe. And they went into, and they, I don't know, I don't remember whether it was an actual like painting in a church or it was an art museum or what, but there was they saw some painting, like Renaissance era painting called like The Final Judgment, that was just this like incredibly like vivid depiction of the trumpet is just blasted, for the last judgment, and everybody's like running around terrified, and like there's one guy he says is like actually throwing up, out of fear in the painting, and he had this moment of realization that he would be one of those people that that he was a sinner essentially, and he says that's the closest thing he's had to a religious experience. So I'm pretty sure when that trip started, he was a Trotskyist. So, it's possible that, there was some point, if only for a week or two, that he had this combination of views. But in any case, yeah, I think it's probably very unlikely. So the idea, for class emancipation, the idea is just that that you think that it's, you think it's a problem for both people's, freedom to kind of live their lives the way they want to, and to sort of have also collective democratic input over, what happens to resources for society to be divided into social classes in the way that it is under capitalism. And this is actually going to be important, even though it's the part they spend the least time on. I think that where they talk about this is where the problem comes in from my perspective, right? Because even though this part isn't wrong necessarily, I think it's something to like kind of keep a close eye on, where they say, so this is like one particular ideal of, emancipatory ideal, and you could have others, they mentioned feminism, for example, that, there's like an ideal of gender equality. And, but this is sort of the one that happens to be associated with the Marxist program. And there's kind of a paragraph there where they say, oh, well, some Marxists have sort of seen Marxism, that seen class emancipation or whatever is like this sort of general, like this sort of general vision of human emancipation, not just like one aspect of it. But we don't really buy into the idea that class emancipation is sort of more important or fundamental than other kinds,
Which I think they do by mostly like imposing like a ridiculously high standard for what would count as class struggle being more important.
Yeah, exactly, right. So this is the thing that I'm really digging them on, right? Because after the historical materialism section, which again, takes up quite a bit of the book. I think it's good stuff. I do think that it like, I think it's like a very sort of ruthlessly calling balls and strikes, but like still quite a bit of the traditional picture survives. Then they go into this class analysis section, and there's this chapter that they kind of refer to in that paragraph that it just said, like, oh, well, we don't think there's, we don't really buy this idea that it's, it's more fundamental. But then you go into the chapter, and it's kind of a strange chapter. It's like, if you're kind of taking it on its own terms, everything that's going on in the chapter, I think, is kind of okay. But like, the way that they're connected it to that sort of broader political issue at the end, I find pretty unconvincing. So they basically say, okay, well, look, if you think that class analysis is more fundamental to what's going on in society as a whole than other kinds of factors, like the sort of autonomous, political, like state level things that, that like a neo-Weberian like Tibor might make a big deal of, or gender structures, for example, then, in order to even evaluate that, we need to take a step back and say, what does it mean to say that like one factor is more important or more fundamental than other factors and lead into some outcome? That's the sort of more general, and here you can kind of see them going into like somebody like Elliott Sober's bailiwick, because he's, is like, this is a very like philosophy of sciencey kind of question, like, like what do we even mean when we say that that like one thing is a bigger or more important or more fundamental cause of an outcome than something else? And they make some reasonable distinctions here, but I think in some ways where I think they go off track is kind of right at the beginning, because they say, okay, there's an obvious sense in which one thing can be more important or more fundamental, like in a pragmatic sense, that it's like, just given whatever questions happen to interest the investigators, right? That they're like, one thing could be more fundamental than another for answering that question. But what we're really trying to figure out is like, whether something could be like objectively more fundamental than something else, and what could that even mean? And so they basically make a couple of cuts. The first one is, so if we're talking about explanatory primacy, one thing is a more primary explanation than another. First cut is quantitative versus qualitative, right? So in other words, that are there two factors that both contribute in the same way, but just one of them does more than the other, right? That would be quantitative. Or qualitative is they're contributed in different ways. And then within quantitative, they say, okay, we can talk about either it's like, essentially, I think this might not be their exact wording, but it's essentially like potency or frequency. So so they give the example of like like primacy in causing cancer between plutonium and cigarettes, that there's a clear sense in which plutonium is a sort of more powerful cause of cancer than cigarettes. That the amount you take, the amount of tobacco in one cigarette, that's not going to have much cancer causing power. But if you take the equivalent amount of plutonium, that's going to have much more. But there's also a sense in which it's like the distribution dependent or something. There's a sense in which cigarettes are a more important cause of cancer than plutonium.
The completely normal sense
Yeah,
that anyone else would think.
Yeah.
Which seems to be the problem, right? Because then it seems like, well, it does seem like that class is just like cigarettes, even if sexism is like plutonium or whatever. In the fact that obviously there's very particular instances, at the very least, where sexism has more explanation than class power, for explaining very particular events once you zoom into the trees. But if we're speaking generally about things like what causes the most cancer in our society, then we should say cigarettes. And if you think about like what kind of social problem is primary, then it seems like we can say class.
Yeah. So this is the sort of move that's pretty close to what I end up saying, but I think the important thing to track here, yeah. So cigarettes are a more important cause of cancer in the sense that cigarettes cause a whole lot more cancer than plutonium
Every
does.
normal sense of the term.
Uh, but either way, right? I think these are sort of both legitimate ways of using like privacy language when it's quantitative, and and but then they're much more skeptical about claims of qualitative privacy, right? So they do agree that there are qualitative asymmetries in the ways that different factors produce outcomes. That, in other words, that there are cases where different causes enter into the chain of cause and effect in like qualitatively different ways, and that this is the case sometimes for class and these other things. So a that in fact, like one of the things that class structures often do, and and one of the things they say, like Marxists will often point out, is that it sets the parameters of what might happen, right? That it doesn't necessarily tell you this is the exact thing that will happen, but that it sort of limits the range of things that might happen. Um, and and they accept that, right? They say, yeah, that is often true, right? That but they're skeptical about the idea that this is sort of intrinsically like a more fundamental kind of causation than selection within the parameters, right? So they have this example, like, if there's a bowl of fruit and it has, it doesn't have peaches in it, but I like apples better than peaches anyway, right? Is the parameter setting contribution, part, like the absence of peaches for the bowl, or is my preference for apples more, like a more primary explanation of my ultimately having an apple? And they sort of say, well, these are just different, right? One's not more more primary than the other. And I think this is a little bit of extrapolation from what they say, but I think it's probably fair to say that their view is that it's that I think they're sort of a little skeptical about the very notion of one thing being qualitatively more primary than another, because I mean, one way of kind of getting at that intuition would just be to say, look, if if you're going to say there's more, like one thing's making a bigger contribution than another, you're making a more claim. And for there to be more, there has to be they have to be commensurable, right? There has to be like a single scale we could use to measure both of them. And so if you're saying, well, they're just contributed in qualitatively different ways, then there's no sense in which one is more than another, which I kind of went back and forth while I was reading about how persuasive I found that part of the argument. I do see their point, but I also wonder if there are, I mean, basically my two quibbles about this are, one, I think that there's a lot of places when I was reading this whole discussion where I kept thinking, like, why don't we just disambiguate? Why don't we just say, like, more important, like primacy subset, subscript 1, primacy subscript 2, right? That it's like, why not just say they're like, yeah, there's a certain sense in which something's more primary because of this, but it's not because of that. And I, that, like, because some of the things they were dismissing, I actually do think that it does seem totally crazy to say that would be a form of greater privacy. So I wondered if they're setting the bar just like artificially too high. And then, I also thought they're just possibilities that they're just kind of leaving on the table, right? Like, okay, if there are different, levels of analysis, different ways that something could contribute, like, could it be possible that like there could be a sense in which, the levels themselves are sort of naturally ordered so that, one is a more fundamental kind of contribution than another? I'm not sure, but like, I wish they'd at least sort of taken the time to kind of explain why not, right? If not, but none of this really gets at my main objection to this, because I'm sort of happy. Like, I don't like, just as a sort of like philosophy of science, right? Just sort of like reading this on that level of abstraction. Are they totally right about this? I don't know. Maybe, right? Like, it's not horribly implausible or anything, but I also think that then at the end, when they introduce that, Marxist triad, and say, and they say the thing about class emancipation versus other kinds of emancipation, that there's a leap, right, from there to there, right? Because they reference this chapter to justify that, but I don't think the chapter does justify it, because basically my move would be to say, and like, I get their point, is that like, when we're just sort of thinking about what's objectively more explanatorily primary, um, is there, for any particular aspect of the society that we live in, is there any guarantee that, class or economic factors is going to have a greater quantitative contribution in that cigarettes versus plutonium kind of way than gender or anything else? Maybe not, right? Like, that might be a little much to sort of, be a priori sure of, but I sort of don't think it really matters, right? Like, because I think that the thing that bothered me about all of this, where the 90s-ishness comes in, is that there, it seems to me that that there's a pretty powerful political tug, not conscious, I'm sure, but still there, right? That existed, if you're like a lefty academic in that era, to be pretty resistant to the idea that there's a like strong sense in which class is primary over these other things.
We've just invented this word called intersectionality, and we're going to abide by it.
Yeah, exactly. I think so. So I think it kind of has to be read in that context. And it's like, well, hold on, man. I could accept every single conceptual move you make in this whole chapter and still say, yeah, okay. But what if, as an investigator, the questions that pragmatically interest me are how to arrive at a society with as little oppression as possible? Then it seems to me that there are extremely good reasons that we aren't really considering here to think that pragmatically, relative to that question, class is actually primary. That if you're, because, especially like, look, if you're having this discussion in Saudi Arabia, then, I think that the sort of, even while capitalism persists, right, that there's like quite a bit you could do to equalize gender relations that has not been done yet, right? But if you're having this discussion in an advanced liberal capitalist country in the 21st century, or even 1992, right, then it seems to me that, when it comes to, civil rights, legal equality, all that stuff, even in 1992, you've pretty much won the war. Like, what's left is like kind of mopping up, some like pockets of insurgency here and there, but like, you've pretty much won the war. And that's not to say that there aren't kinds of gender inequality that don't most definitely persist. But then we think about the kinds that do persist, just to stick with that example for a moment, we could do race in a second. Like, it's what's the most powerful lever that we have to do anything about it, right? And it seems to me that the most powerful levers are economic. If you just think about how many people, for example, don't leave bad or even physically abusive relationships because they can't afford to strike out on their own, they're worried about what their lives are going to be like. Then this would be a pretty obvious pretty obvious case, right? Or you think about the ways that kind of different kinds of child rearing relationships, different couples, might ideally like to have if they had lots of money, right? That's versus what they do have, right? I think that having a more economically egalitarian society is like kind of the main thing that would address those. And then especially when you start, you move from gender and you start thinking about, race, which I actually originally, for about, I don't know, for like the last 10 months or something, I've been forcing myself to be super strict about this 3,000 word upper limit, for these essays. So originally I had, and then I had to end up cutting this whole thing about ontology of race. I had like 4 paragraphs on that. But suffice to say now, I think the idea that there is this like thing called race that exists is a bit of an issue. It's something that could stand to be a little bit more careful about how we talk about. But racial, which is not to say, of course, that racial prejudice doesn't exist and have bad consequences in the world. Of course, it does. And it's also not to say that racial disparities don't exist. Of course they do, right? Massively. But when you say, oh, see, so we need to be thinking in terms of this like independent axis of oppression and what we're going to do about that independent axis of oppression, I tend to think that misses the point for 2 reasons, right? So there's a reason the illustration for this one is the 3 authors of Reconstructing Marxism, Wright, Levine, and Sober, plus Adolf Reed, right, as sort of the representative of the view that I find more compelling about all of this, and the sort of and basically the sort of point that you get from thinkers like him is 2 things, right? One is normative and the other is strategic. So the normative point is, well, hold on. Like if there's this disparity, Black people are more likely than white people to live in poverty and thus experience all the social ills that come with poverty. Substandard education, higher crime rate, militarized policing, mass incarceration, all that stuff, right? Okay. Is the thing that's the problem here the disparity or the thing itself? Right? Like in other words, if there was some bit of social engineering we could do that would result in exactly demographically appropriate sections of every population living in poverty and experiencing all of those horrors, would we say, oh, good, mission accomplished, we've achieved justice, right? Or would we say, well, actually, this is at least a little unclear, how much this even counts as progress. So that's the normative thing. But even if you disregard the normative point, even if you think, no, all that matters is that there are disparities, I would still say on a strategic level, okay, well, what's the plan?
Right, even if we only take it that that's a problem, it's still not going to be solved by in-job privilege workshops.
Yes, right. Yes. That is most definitely not going to be solved by privilege workshops yes, what are those like privilege walks where people like take a step forward or backwards for every layer of privilege that they have. And
It is weird how much of privilege theory and kind of workshops and so on are about kind of like publicly humiliating workers
yes, there's so much of that.
in like an organized, systemic manner.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it
But yeah, I was
really.
going to say, because I get to talk about my PhD for once.
Oh yeah.
After kind of the abolition, because you've been talking about how we basically abolished kind of the formal legal inequalities that were part of the early liberal age and the previous feudal age, were especially dominant in the previous feudal age. which were kind of the legal separations between persons. And now there's like one or two that still exist, which is often the common thing where women are excluded from frontline combat service. But apart
Yeah.
from that, it's more or less universal that kind of human adults have equal rights, have formal
Yeah.
legal equality. But what we're left with after that is two forms of inequality. One of which is kind of material inequality, which is something which is booming constantly,
Right.
has been for 40 years now. And then there's also the informal inequalities of the social sphere, as Chandler calls them. And what privilege theory and what kind of woke stuff focuses on is very much on these informal inequalities of the social sphere, which is the
Yeah.
thing, where like black people get followed around Walmart.
Right.
But do we really think that like security guards are like so kind of ontologically racist that has more to do with kind of bad training rather than kind of a poor mapping of who and who is not as poor?
Yeah. No, exactly. I think that sounds exactly right to me. I think that there's a lot like that there is a lot of I mean, I think the obvious reality when you're talking about stuff like Walmart security or you're talking about police violence, etc., like the obvious reality of it is that a lot of times blackness is sort of used as a as a proxy, as like, oh, you're more likely to be poor, which is why every once in a while when you have the like black professor in Ivy League University or something who's like hassled in some situation by the cop, it's a scandal, right? Because the system misfired. Um, but yeah, and I think even there, right, the point applies, right? I mean, in a more, like I
You
think
know,
that
that's almost certainly that security guard making an error for
yeah,
which they not get fired for, and one
yeah,
which
yeah,
they
yeah,
wouldn't do if they had correctly kind of assigned the demographics of the person. What they're doing is because they're racist and because they live in a racist society, they're accidentally misattributing this black person to be like a poor person or a disruptive person or so on.
yeah. No, exactly. And and if you want to solve that problem, I think there are good reasons to think that you know moves even partially right in the direction of a more materially equal society are going to do more to solve it than consciousness raising Walmart security guards. And I mean, look, so yeah, clearly all of the sort of you know ritual abasement at work, uh, is not something that cures racism. In fact, at this point, we actually have a fair amount of empirical data on that.
Empirical data, which seemingly was all published after I started my PhD, and I'm just reading now at the end, which is quite annoying.
Yeah, right. So it's good news is that you're still reading it before most people, since they're just
Yeah.
not bothering to. But yeah, I mean, none of the data supports that stuff working. It sort of doesn't make very much sense at a common sense level to think that it would work very well. And it's so if it's not that, then what is the plan? I mean, a more serious idea could be that you could have material redistribution, not with the aim of just creating a generally equal society, but like with the aim specifically of eliminating racial disparities in wealth, which is a very polysyllabic way of saying reparations, right? That's yes, just need more anti-racist babies. That will surely do it, right? And, and that doesn't, I mean, as I said, take like in the thought experiment where you could just magically do that, right? Like we will away all the political obstacles. Then that makes more sense than, oh, we just we just need to book Robin DiAngelo to yell at more people at work. Uh, but uh, but also it's sort of the ultimate, it's like the South Park thing with the stealing underpants question mark profit, that like where what's the scenario where this would actually happen, right? Like
Yeah.
this is
Well,
you
I
know
mean, I was going to say that actually discursively, it does actually have the effect of really challenging something, but the thing it really challenges is the thing we'd want to keep, which is kind of these liberal rights that we've won.
yeah,
This is
no,
this is what Lewis Gordon says about this. A professor from Connecticut. He says that these legal rights, these formal things, things that are called privilege, are things that we should all want. And
yeah,
so, discursively, it actually flips everything around by it essentially denounces all the good things we do have because some people lack them, which seems completely backwards. And intentionally, privilege is trying to flip the discursive frame around in this way, but it flips it around. It looks really bad.
yeah. No, I definitely agree with that. I actually wrote an essay for Arc Digital Media, I think maybe back in 2020, called "The Problem with Privilege Talk," which is something that I think I might have had to cut out of an early draft of Canceling Comedians, but but essentially it was making this point that like, look, I really, I suspect that part of what it gets down to is a lot of liberals feel uncomfortable using the word oppression because like that has a very I don't know, like retro new left kind of sound to it, right? Whereas like privilege goes down a little easier. But it's actually really bad to redefine things that absolutely everybody should have
I think
as
a big appeal of it is because from the start, privilege has been regarded as something that people are unaware of.
right.
So you do this thing both of revealing, but saying it's kind of not your fault in another way, like kind of it was hidden from you, and now it's shown, and you can do these things. But you know, it's not like racism that you've obviously see every day. White privilege is this hidden thing,
Yeah. That's the invisible knapsack, right? That was the
Yeah,
Peggy
yeah, yeah.
McIntosh thing. Which some of that, if you actually read that list, some of it is absolutely insane. Like just because it's like,
I mean, the most fascinating one is she says that one of her privileges as a white person is the ability to easily get an academic article on white privilege published, which is like, no, of course it fucking isn't. It's because you're an academic.
yeah, exactly.
That's such an obviously more over-determining factor than that you're white.
Yes, in fact, it'd probably have been easier if she was an academic and everything else was the same, but she wasn't. Like realistically, uh, but but yeah, the one I always found like bizarre was that's a white privilege that you can go into a record store. You can tell it's an old article, right? That there are more record stores, but go into a record store and easily find music made by people of my race. It's like, is the history of popular music in Peggy's alternate dimension very different from ours? Because that is not an exclusively white privilege, let me tell you. But but yeah, like a lot of the list is just like, oh, just kind of being treated with the respect that like any person should be, right? It's like,
Yeah.
no, that's not a privilege. That's not something. It's like, oh, look, I just discovered that I got this without earning it. It's like nobody should have to earn that, right? That should be a default for everybody. And like a lot of the stuff I would see over the years, um, I feel like I see a bit less now, but it's hard to tell whether that's
It's actually really interesting. In her second article on privilege, she
uh,
kind of makes this point and makes the point that there should actually be a careful distinction between the things we'd wish to universalize and things we would wish to abolish. Like we would want, for instance, like the ability for male academics to kind of talk down to women academics, not to be universalized to women academics, but got rid of. What other things would want to be universalized? But then she drops that and doesn't elaborate on in her future privilege work, and then no one takes her up on it. So
yeah,
then we just do the basic version of privilege. It's weird. She actually
yeah. No,
says
that
in
is
the article, I think now privilege is out of date. in like the second article on privilege on
And
one
then
white
she,
privilege.
so the moment of lucidity passed and she went right back to it. Yeah, right. Like, but so yeah, I feel like I see this less now. I don't know how much of that is a larger political cultural vibe shift, and how much of that is just that I've managed to surround myself with people I find less annoying. But like I feel like I used to see this a lot in cases where like some I don't know, like some group of like right wing white people would be in a conversation, would be in a confrontation with the police, but like, aha, white privilege. They didn't just kill them all. It's like, okay,
Yeah.
uh, is that what we want? It's like that's the thing that we want to universalize is cops just like being really quick to kill people
Have you
in
seen
these kinds of situations.
a white Republican congresswoman use the phrase like
Yes. When
seriously?
Hunter Biden came
Yeah,
in
yeah. You came
to
late, I think.
yeah. That was I think that was Marjorie Taylor Greene. That's who said that. Who's the if you've only vaguely heard of her, you probably mostly heard of her in connection with the Jewish space lasers.
It
But
wasn't her. It was like some semi never Trumper South Carolina congresswoman.
oh, I'm not sure. Maybe somebody in the chat will know. But yeah, like I, so yeah, I think that this is, so like at least material reparations sort of, again, relative to the flawed normative assumption, at least makes some sense as like a solution to disparities. But even if we're bracketing the normative objection and we're saying, yeah, the thing that we care about is disparities, doesn't really matter where the bottom is or where the top is. It just matters that the distribution is right. Even if we're assuming that, the obvious problem with saying that that's the lever we should be pulling on is that it's stuck, right? It's
Mm.
this is, like, look, any sort of social change that would be bad for the material interests of the people who have the most power in our society is incredibly difficult at the best of times, right? That's just sort of a general. I think that's just a true generalization that about really any society. That the people who if the people who have the most power in that society would be adversely affected by some change in the distribution of resources, achieving it is very hard. Not necessarily impossible, but very hard. But that's the baseline for what I want. And it's also the baseline for like reparation style proposals. But I would point out that if you're talking about achieving universal economic redistribution, right? So you're, like, just to pick a sort of incremental social democratic example, you're talking about, for example, fixing the disparity in how many, the percentages of white and black people who don't have health insurance by just having universal health insurance for everybody. Then relative to the fact that, sure, very, very tall mountain to climb politically, but at least it's possible in principle to see how you could get together a majority of the population on board with that proposal, which really seems like a bare minimum necessary condition for overcoming the obstacles to any kind of proposal for redistributive social change. Whereas if you're talking about proposals that sort of by definition only benefit some people, and not most people, then that seems just much more difficult on its face, right? Like this seems like a pretty obvious. This seems like a pretty obvious problem, and one that generalizes, right? So I think there's both a sort of normative thing that you alluded to earlier. Said, okay, look, uh, it's actually a good thing that we have certain kinds of ideals of like liberal universalism in place, that that everybody should get the same package of rights no matter what. Like that's sort of, I mean, view from 10,000 feet, right? That's the bourgeois revolution, which was a good thing. And and the sort of completion of it through the civil rights movement, and and legal equality for women and all of that stuff was a good thing, right? Like that's a good foundation to build on. And so I think I think trying to kind of undermine it in a way that would restore differential legal statuses, even with an anti-oppression intention, is something you should probably be real careful about in any case, right? But then beyond that,
Degrowth, but for rights.
yeah, exactly, exactly. That's degrowth and human rights. That's which I tend to think would also come from the usual kind of degrowth anyway. But that's but even if you're not sort of troubled by the normative worry, it's still just strategically, like I think it remains true that the best, like your best shot at getting social change that would adversely affect the interests of the people whose interests are most powerful is by making your pitch in a way that at least can appeal to the majority of the population. And this itself gives me a reason to think that sort of universalist economic solutions to oppression are the thing on which it makes the most sense to focus, because it's the not because it would like magically get rid of all other forms of prejudice or injustice. I actually don't think that, right? Like I think some of that stuff has like it's like plutonium. It has a long half-life. But because if you're trying to think, okay, what are the things my politics could be oriented towards that are going to have the most effects in bringing about a world with the least oppression and injustice, and for that matter, even casual social prejudice in it, that seems like the ticket to me.
Nice. Did you want to talk about historical materialism, or you want to kind of taper off? Because I do have an anecdote to tell.
Okay, let's do your anecdote, and let's do like 10 minutes on historical materialism.
Well, because in the historical materialism essay, you were speaking about kind of the collapse of the Roman Empire and the slave mode of production collapsing and the imperial center collapsing and all this European trade network collapsing. But the whole time I was like, why don't we talk about the Bronze Age collapse? The Bronze Age collapse, which I guess maybe isn't the right thing to talk about because Marx didn't really know about the Bronze Age collapse apart from in probably like very vague terms.
Yeah, I actually know very little about this. What
All right.
tell me more.
Well, probably the most genuinely straightforward, massive social decline that we had was the Bronze Age collapse, where we went from
the Bronze Age collapse. You said. I just make sure I'm hearing you correctly.
yeah, Bronze Age
Okay.
collapse,
Okay.
where
Yeah.
we went from having state societies in Egypt, in Mycenaean Greece, in Assyria, and these sorts of places. These societies collapsed, and outside of Egypt, state society in Europe disappeared. State society in Europe also broadly disappeared after the collapse of the Roman Empire, but it was much less collapsed, and from a high starting point already, as well as it survived in the Eastern Roman Empire. And even in Egypt, things got very, very bad for very, very many people. And it was a combination of disease and barbarian invasion, but also because of these Bronze Age states had like insane command economies on incredibly low technologies to degrees you wouldn't really believe the degree of like command economy they had by like a bureaucratic state. And this was just incredibly vulnerable to once one part of it goes, once the trade networks start breaking down. Like, they were based on bronze, but no country had both copper and tin in it. And so the principle of your society, the most basic material you need to do Bronze Age stuff, bronze, can only be made through like a large scale international trade network. But I say this all because I heard a very interesting anecdote, which is in Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad, he talks about the Mycenaean Greeks and he talks about their military forces. But he imagines that the Mycenaean military was like the military of the Greek Dark Ages where he was writing from. which is
Yeah.
to say it was like heroic band of infantry. But that wasn't true. The Mycenaean state had professional chariot cavalry based on kind of like a barracks network with armories and so on. It was not the heroic bands of the Greek Dark Age. And it's just very interesting that Homer's work of the Odyssey and the Iliad are probably the only genuinely post-apocalyptic fiction we have, in the sense not of fiction that's written about a hypothetical apocalypse.
Fiction that was written after the apocalypse,
Yes.
try to imagine life before it. Nice.
Yeah, yeah. As if now we imagined that like World War II was a battle between like biker gangs or something like this.
I like that. Yeah. No, this is largely new to me. I think um I don't know. There's probably the probably fewer podcasts and stuff about it. So that's why I use Rome. But but yeah, I mean the essential point about historical materialism, which uh, both of the other two essays we mentioned were about. So there's the historical materialism in the 1990s, which was the first of the two Reconstructing Marxism essays, and then did a midweek bonus essay last week, with shorter than like a real Sunday one, called "What Marxist Materialism Isn't," and both of these are about historical materialism and the kind of reason that the collapse of the Roman Empire is coming in, or maybe that the Bronze Age collapse should have come in, is that um, these are cases where there's actual regression in the development of the forces of production, which I think one of the basic premises of historical materialism is that the sort of trend line always going to go up, right? That there's the sort of transhistorical tendency for the forces of production to develop over the long term, and I think you do end up needing that to make sense of some other claims, but I actually think that's fine, right? And it's like clearly it's not like Marx was unaware, maybe about the Bronze Age stuff, but certainly of the Roman case, right? I mean, like in fact, that's presumably what he's primarily thinking of in the Communist Manifesto, where he talks about the class struggle ending with either the victory of a new class, a new mode of production, or the common collapse of the contending classes, right? Sort of one of the earliest socialism or barbarism arguments made in the tradition. So, but the point is that it doesn't, it's not like, oh, there's just some sort of complicated cultural contingency that goes into whether the trend line tends to go up or tends to go down. It's like, no, it tends to go up, and it takes some like absolutely catastrophic exogenous shock on the level of the collapse of the Roman Empire, or the Bronze Age collapse, in order for it to go down for like a while, right? But
Yeah,
like,
and normally, when the Roman Empire collapses, China's just doing fine.
right,
Or when China has the warring state period, then Assyria, the new Assyrian Empire, is doing just fine. Or the
yeah,
Indus Valley civilizations are doing just fine. So because you have these three centers of state societies, I don't think there was ever a point where they all went together.
yeah, yeah, right. Like, and even when one of them did, right? It's like, I mean, look, I would note that the level of development in 21st century Italy is greater than that of third century Rome, right? Like,
Right, yeah, Bronze Age Egypt was sick as hell, but I'm sure if the current Egyptian state put their mind to it, they could build some pyramids.
yes, exactly. Uh, in fact, I think they could probably, they choose not to because they're less concerned with their heads of state future journeys into the land of the dead, but but yes, if the current Egyptian state decided to build some pyramids, they could do it way faster and more efficiently
Do
than
you know who couldn't? The British state. It'd be half built after 20 years, and then it'd be cancelled.
Yeah, that's kind of fair. And yeah, that which is also credit where credit's due. Uh, I saw a good post by Sohrab Ahmari earlier today where he's talking about, he's saying like that there is actually like some genuine insight in all those complaints about like, what happened to the flying cars we were promised, that, it's like the, mid-century, he said like New Deal era, technological innovations were awe-inspiring and terrifying, nukes going to the moon,
It's interesting to think back on like early gender transition that people did and how they
yeah,
were treated in like public media, where it
yeah,
was this thing of where people were like, when a doctor said, I've turned this person from a man into a woman, they were like, wow,
yeah,
crazy. But they completely believed it. They thought like, why would you do that? But there wasn't the doubt that that's common now, where you can't actually do that. And obviously, they were coming from an era where there was this thing where in the early when they first
uh,
synthesized insulin, they were
uh,
walking around the ward where all the dying children were dying from
yeah,
diabetes, and then just injecting them with the synthesized insulin, and they were just coming back to life like on the spot, like it was
right,
Christ-like, it was godly what was happening. And there was
yeah,
just this mid-century both trust and belief in doctors, in medical science, and science in general, as well as real results to back it up, that I think right now we just can't imagine.
yeah. That's the yeah. I found the tweet. It's there's a deep wisdom behind complaints like what happened to flying cars, what happened to colonizing Mars. Our technological innovations mostly tend towards simulations of mastering the material world rather than actually mastering the material world in grand scales. The technologies, the New Deal, were awesome and terrifying, nukes, literal moonshots, etc. The technologies of the neoliberal era are like, whoa, I can point my phone at the song that's playing at the restaurant, instantly download it myself for 99 cents. Uh, which, I think there is some truth to, but whatever you want to say about like dysfunction of state building projects and all of that, which is also, some of those mid-century, well, actually, yeah, I mean, both of his examples of mid-century innovations were done within the public sector, right? That's which is which is also an interesting point that like that I think people often miss when they're talking about economic planning and what can or can't be done with economic planning and all of that stuff. There are things that economic planning, like that, so far we don't have good like models of centralized state planning doing.
Right. I mean, to
But
completely make up a figure, which might not be, maybe right or
uh,
wrong, I would bet that the Soviet Union in 1945 had a smaller GDP than the NASA budget of 2024.
yes, yes, that seems
But
right.
the Soviets did everything with that, while also doing 100 other things.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, there are lots of things that centralized economic planning hasn't been successful at doing. But one thing that's actually been remarkably successful at doing is technological innovation. Like this is, I mean, the Mariana Mazzucato, I think that's her name, right? Is that who's like not a socialist or anything like that, but in her book, The Entrepreneurial State, or you can watch your TED talk about this. This is like the only time I'll recommend a TED talk. The, she
Ben,
like
when are
does
you going to have a TED talk?
she does this thing where she like
Great to see chance.
pulls out like an iPhone and points out that like everything in it that like makes it a smartphone, not a dumb phone, um, is as a result of like state funded research, right? The internet itself, the GPS, the touchscreen technology, I mean, a lot of these things were done. Um, a lot of these things were done by the Defense Department, but I don't think there's any sort of historical law that you have to have the ultimate intention of killing people in order to come up with these things.
I was listening to a Soviet astronaut song, and the lyrics was like so insanely optimistic, but also, I guess, backed by the circumstances they were in. that it's hard to believe it's not like a sci-fi song. Like
Yeah, yeah.
something written in the 20th or 21st century, but meant to be set in the 23rd century, but was something written in the mid 20th century, meant to be written then. The one thing that gives it away is that in the first verse he talks about having a final smoke before they launch.
I
But
actually,
the lyrics, the next verse is, I believe, friends, caravans of rockets will head us forward from star to star on the dusty paths of the distant planets. Our footsteps will be left as our marks.
wow. Uh,
Like a level of optimism, which is just, we're completely incredulous now of.
yeah, it's, yeah. No, the cigarettes are funny. I actually just watched a video essay called "Smoking in the Future," that was basically about like all of the science fiction where like like you watch like the first Alien movie and like everybody's smoking on the spaceship, which is at least the Soviet song has that note of realism, that you're having your last one before you get on the spaceship. uh, but uh, but yeah, I mean, I think that so I think that like I agree with all that, right? But it's like also as sort of as annoying as like the sort of the thing that was lost from like the World War II, early Cold War period, where there was uh, all of this like grandiose techno optimism on on both sides, right? That had of the Cold War, that was still, even in the capitalist West, was still linked to like the sort of aggressive state sector that was
Yeah.
was involved in pulling it off, right? So it's like I do think that there's something that is depressing about what's been lost there. But yeah, the point about historical materialism is just like the actual productive capacity of society, our ability to figure out how to more efficiently interface with what we get from nature to to create things that meet human needs. Does that there's this certain tendency for it to to go up over
Yeah, we,
time.
we, have, we have so much now, which is why so much can be wasted on complete bullshit.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's exactly because of that fact, right? We can only have all this insanely silly stuff of people having baffling amounts of money, which they use on baffling things, exactly because we live in, by far and away, the most incredibly wealthy history of era of human history ever.
Yeah, no, I think that's what very well said, and that's the thing that you know, and I know we haven't talked much about the other essay. We'll probably have to save that, but they have but like I think that, but yeah, I mean, just to connect a dot or two here at the end, I mean, that's the exact fact that that makes it so incredibly galling. That we do live in such such an unequal society, right? That there's absolutely no reason why I mean, if we in 2024 you take the most like awe-inspiringly well developed productive machine that's ever existed, and it could absolutely support like everybody having a good life, and what sort of annoying work still has to be done, being spread around much more thinly, and and etc. And I think the obstacles to this are are political, right? They're not logistical anymore. So you know and I tend to I tend to think that there's another thing that they talk about in Reconstructing Marxism, very briefly, right? But they sort of have this analogy about like clinical medicine, where they say that the way when they think about class analysis, that there's supposed to be this kind of feedback loop between Marxist theory and Marxist practice, um, that the same way that like sort of what happened in a clinical setting would inform theory and all of that stuff, and they kind of say, well, for better or worse, this is broken down, to a great extent, because the sort of traditional Marxist parties that existed in various places around the world in 1992 were, in various places to various varying extents, we're rapidly shedding that. But they sort of tried to look on the bright side and say, well, okay, at least this opens up, much more room for, for like, theoretical innovation, because you're not like constrained by the dogmatism of, the like Communist Party line or whatever, right? Like many, 20th century Marxist intellectuals were. And, fair enough, that is a bright side, but I do think that, I do think that all of the kind of identity politics stuff that, you could see in a relatively small way, if we're grading at a curve for the era, creeping into this, really shows that it's like, look, if you're just writing from within left liberal academia, it's not like you don't have a feedback loop politically. It's just a different one, right? And it maybe it imposes a less rigid dogma, but the sort of general direction of it is actually, I think, ultimately, much less helpful, because, what if the last 32 years since this book came out of left liberal identitarianism got us as far as achieving a more equal society? I would argue very little.
I just remember Joe Biden. I was just laughing about Joe Biden. Kamala Harris is pretty.
Gotta spell that out.
No, I just remember Joe Biden. It's really funny because I mean,
like he exists.
Yeah, I mean that's the end of 30 years of liberal identitarianism. It's Joe Biden is president in the year 2024. And
Yeah.
it's meant to be the most important thing in the world that he remains president until 2029.
I mean, I don't know how realistic that is, but I mean, even if he wins the election, but I don't know if you've seen some of these recent press conferences. The man is in bad shape, but we could get Kamala. If he can limp through the election, we could get Kamala Harris as president. In which case, the press conferences would get much less sad, but also much funnier.
Yeah, she's on a much more fun collection of drugs than Joe Biden is.
Exactly.
He's on like amphetamines and things to make his heart not stop, while she's on like 4 different kinds of Xans.
That seems right. And it's that yeah. But there you go. That's what the last 32 years of left liberal identity politics have given us is these people. And I don't know. I'd rather not.
You gonna watch the Super Bowl?
No, I don't think I am, because I would have, but the Detroit Lions broke my heart by not making it. And
I hope Taylor Swift loses.
Yes. Yeah. No, I saw somebody. I think this was ironic. I don't think this was made by somebody who actually thinks this originally. I mean, I saw like a leftist posted it, but it was like this meme that was like, yes, very good, as it should be. This meme that was like, San Francisco, it was like Team Jesus, and then, it was the Kansas City Chiefs, Team Soros, and had like a picture of Taylor Swift, and that's which would be particularly good if San Francisco of all places, got to be Team Jesus, and Kansas City was Team Soros.
Yeah, it's funny how things keep flipping around. There's this thing of American conservatives are, they're opposing apple pie, which is, it's liberal.
Yeah, exactly.
So what are you writing next week, and what do you think we're going to be streaming about next week, Ben? Subject to change, but it's good to tease them anyway.
Yeah, fair enough. So you know what? I think regardless of what I write next week, I think we should cover the essay that came out today, because we didn't do it today. So that's the one on Jeremy Kaufman, who is a libertarian entrepreneur and politician, and a some bizarre views that he expressed about property rights and sexual autonomy, and this is and that's what I was talking about in that one, and that seems like it would be a fun stream. So we should do it.
On self ownership, right?
Yes, exactly. Yep.
Yeah, which does seem to be like a very bizarre and particular thing, which could only emerge out of a certain kind of like analytic political philosophy.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean,
If you can only own your body if you aren't a body, right?
that's an interesting question. Yes, what's self ownership? You're owning yourself, but yeah, that's it's an
Like that, there has
interesting.
to be some alienation between the things.
Yeah, I think that I think people who talk this way are very confused. That's what I argue in the essay. But that the idea that your rights over yourself are a kind of property sort of makes very little sense when you actually start to dig into it. And I don't know. I mean, I always think about that line in the manifesto about all relationships between humans being reduced
Yeah,
to
yeah.
cash nexus. That this is sort of an extreme nerdy philosophical instance of that being done. That it's like,
It was
oh,
interesting. There was actually a thread about this on As Philosophy recently, where someone was being like, well, if you have self ownership, then you have a complete right to dispose of yourself as you wish. People were like, well, that's normally not true with normal property rights. So,
uh,
like in
like
the sense that you can't burn down your own house.
oh yeah. You could. It's an interesting question actually. So you could have like, yeah, what could you?
Like,
Because like the problem.
what would self ownership seems like bullshit, but wouldn't even establish that much in the end because there's plenty
Yeah,
of stuff which is owned by us, but we can't do loads of different things with.
yeah, no, it's an interesting question. Like, what rights actually go into property rights and what don't? I mean, like, as far as burning down your house, it's like maybe if you live in the middle of nowhere and it's like a very carefully controlled fire,
But
maybe.
otherwise, if you live in a terrace, then it's not happening.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, if we flip it back to abortion, and obviously pro-life people think
Yeah.
babies or people or whatever. I can't kill someone just because he's in my house.
Yeah. It's an interesting point. Yeah, I think what exactly this does or doesn't follow from it. It's also an interesting question. Like, I don't know if we lived in a libertarian utopia, if the somebody was in your house without your permission,
Utopia.
could you just kill them? That's I hope not, but I guess you'd have to ask a libertarian about that. That's yeah. I think I think if the yeah if they were dug in so well that like there was no way to get them out of your house except for killing them, then yeah, would that be okay? Yeah, no, I think this is like I actually like this it's a different one than I give in the essay, but like I think this is maybe another reason to think this is just a really bad model
Yeah.
for sort of trying to make sense of what kind of autonomy we think that people have.
But yeah,
Uh,
I think it'll be an interesting discussion also because I'm very against the idea of kind of consent based morality anyway.
yeah, well, hope there's a little bit of consent based morality in there, or else you know that would lead to bad things. But yeah, um, I think that I think that yeah, the consent is very important for lots of contexts. It's certainly not the whole of morality, and this
Right,
is
but the kind of I think I mentioned to you before, but there are quite a lot of young people online who
who
have
think it is
some
the
kind
whole
of
of
like
morality.
yeah, like consent solipsism, where not only
Yeah,
do they think that consent is the totality of morality, you'll talk to them about it and they can't imagine anything else could possibly be kind of the basis of morality, and they'll just
yeah,
redefine everything else into to be being based on consent.
yeah, yeah. Of a yeah, sort of right overdosed on a certain kind of philosophical liberalism, but
I'm
well,
going to play the outro.
sounds
Bye,
good.
everyone.